The following has been brought to you despite great danger. Please listen and heed the warning within. Godspeed and safe listening.
Good evening, my name is Shooter Jennings, and in 2010 I released an album called Black Ribbons. It featured the master of horror, Stephen King, as Will-O-The-Wisp, a radical radio show host who was hopelessly clinging on during his final night of broadcast before public airways were restricted to government-approved transmissions. In this show, we're going to delve into some of the great stories and tales that inspired Black Ribbons. Welcome to Beyond the Black.
Beyond the Black.
Episode 4. Hello, children of the night. We are back for episode 4 of Beyond the Black. Again, I have to thank everyone for hanging in there with us as we're exploring the dark regions of the subculture of the subconscious. It's been a literal blast for me to be able to go back and put myself in the exciting mind frame of cultural exploration that I was in when I was recording Black Ribbons. 2008 and 2009 were the years of my waking up period, if you want to call it that, and I remember just being so mind blown after doing a little research and digging and finding that so many realities that I based my life on were just a house of cards about to fall. I hope that some of you are having the same kind of exciting awakening that I did while I retrace my creative steps that led me to Black Ribbons. Since this episode starts with All of This Could Have Been Yours, I'd like to take a moment to discuss what that song is really about and what emotionally was invested in the lyrics. It's not a conspiracy song, it's a song about grief and disappointment and loneliness. All of this could have been yours.
Black clouds roll in over red dawn. As the waves were high, so was I. And the moon never looked so angry as when your walls came crumbling down. It was so beautiful, it was so peaceful. All the destruction
My experience as a major label recording artist on Nashville's Universal South Records started out great. Dave Cobb and the 357s and I had all recorded Put the O Back in Country, my first record, on our own, and Tony Brown and Tim DuBois signed me and allowed us to put out the record in its original form without a single change. That was a huge compliment, and it was a big show of trust in me as an artist by two incredibly talented and generous individuals. That record, along with our second record, Electric Rodeo, were truly pure records, in my opinion, of unabashed creativity and enjoyment of making music. I'll never forget how good those years felt, as we were allowed to create anything we wanted and project a message we believed in, without fear of the man coming in and messing with our records. While my third record, The Wolf, was also untouched, Tim and Tony had departed ways with Universal South. And the new guy who had been brought in was, in all honesty, he wasn't the creative type guy. He was a money guy, and it changed the dynamic. Sometimes a small change in the molecules in a proverbial room can make the whole thing fall apart. Now, while country radio had gotten behind, and I don't really believe in genres, but country radio had gotten behind a few of the songs on my first album, and by the time we released Electric Rodeo, our second record, I think corporate radio felt like we were nothing more than troublemakers and fire starters, and they kind of shut us out. And that was the beginning of the fall, if you will. By the time I got in the studio to record my third record, The Wolf, I felt as if I'd failed and was being judged if my new record didn't get any traction at radio. A combination of that feeling plus the fact that my relationship with my guitar player, Leroy Powell, was falling apart. Leroy and I are friends now, and it's all good, but it was definitely a bump in the road as far as our friendship went, and such a strain has been repaired. You know what I'm saying? And I love Leroy. He's a killer player, and I love playing with him, and we still do things together. He was on my most recent release from the Southern Family record that Dave Cobb put together, Can You Come Over? Leroy plays guitar on that. But anyway, me and Leroy had split up, if you will. And I was insecure nonetheless. I felt like I didn't have much of a ground to stand on with my label and even my own band, and it created a crack in the cement that would later crumble and require me to take a good long look in the mirror and pick up the pieces and go home, as Fleetwood Mac would say. At the end of the run of the last tour for The Wolf, I was given the option to stay at Universal South on a major label, but I had to change the way I made my records. They wanted me to spend less money in the studio. They wanted me to rehearse my songs live, and it's just I just don't like people coming in then, and they just, they wanted me to cut singles and things, and I had never been put in that position. I didn't want to. My other option was to leave. Feeling like my whole world was a mess and I needed a broom the size of Brooklyn to clean it up, I decided to move on and figure myself out before I put more music out there. And that's where Black Ribbons came from. And it was definitely the awakening I needed to be myself and really stop caring about what others felt. Although I didn't really fully gain that, I feel, until recently, and maybe we'll get into that at some other point. But it's a cliche kind of lesson, but it's a lesson that was very real for me. I was left very depressed. I felt I'd fucked up my whole life in a lot of ways. I'm sure this feels like first world problems or 1000th world problems for all that matter, but for me it was a very real experience. To have been on a major label and then to feel rejected, well, it just took my confidence in it that I thought was so rock solid as a foundation, and it flew 2 commercial jets right into it. I know. The song All of This Could Have Been Yours is often regarded as a love song about a relationship gone bad, but the song was directed right at the Nashville music business for me. You see, the Nashville music business, that corporate entity, as a child for me was some kind of a finally made it type situation. But after getting a good taste of it and realizing how much bigger my dad's shadow was to those guys than it was to me, I felt completely abandoned, and that's what the song is about. Each line talks about how I felt like what we had to offer was going to make our style of music more progressive, make country music more progressive. We were bringing in a lot of elements like psychedelia, and really we were making what we thought was cool music. The music of pop country is not cool to me. It doesn't sound cool. It's very produced. It has a thing. But my favorite bands are the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and, all the way down to these tiny bands, including, and then there's Hank Williams and Hank Williams Jr. and all of that. I mean, just the cool shit from the 70s and the 60s and the 50s. That's what we liked, and we thought we were bringing in something new but keeping the country music songwriting mentality. Eventually, when we hit a wall, I was left out in a boat in turbulent waters all by myself and abandoned by the entire business. I got it, though. It was a clear message. But specifically, the ending to All of This Could Have Been Yours referred to the many times that I was on the road while my oh-so-important commercial music career was failing, and there was no one who cared. My phone would ring all the time from 2005 to 2007 with people who cared so much for what I was doing and what was going on. But the minute I was old news, they were gone, and I was left with the few true friends that I'd been human enough to keep the whole way. Some of which fell by the wayside, by the way, and I spent years repairing those relationships. Look, I know all this seems like self-absorbed whining, but you have to realize when you're 23 years old and you get a record deal and you have people telling you you're the greatest at sold-out shows, it's genuinely hard to keep a real perspective. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. You see, my dad was the greatest dad anybody could ever ask for. I was luckily born at a time when he was figuring out his life, and he really cared about being a part of my life. So the idea of a shadow, if you will, never entered my mind. I was proud of his music, and he was proud of mine. But then he passed away, and then there were no more talks about how things are and how things are going to be. I just had to kind of figure it out on my own. And by this time, the song was just that, a figuring out of who I was and what I'd done wrong, who I'd done wrong, and how I could repair it. Now, 3 of the lines, and all of this could have been yours, have this ability to transport me back to the exact moment I felt them. Each time I sing them on stage, I can see where I was when I experienced this. So I'm going to share those with you. I think that's a good way of dealing with this song. The first one is all of the times that I couldn't go home and all of the times that I froze all alone. I remember being on tour for The Wolf after I'd left the label. James mentioned the amazing photographer who's done so much work with me on so many of my records and did all of the art for Electric Rodeo, the inserts of Electric Rodeo. He was traveling on the road with us, I remember this, but it wasn't a long run like he had done before. We were playing some kind of whacked out casino in way North America, and all the passes to the gig were snowed out. I think it was in the Northwest, but it was right up there next to Canada. And all the passes were snowed out, and we had to strap chains on our tires and change the pass just to make the gig. And I remember waking up freezing in my bunk of the bus. Yes, I know, poor old me, I had a bus. I don't know. Just trust me. I miss those days. I miss having a bus. I would love to have one, but they are very expensive. And if you want to bring the money home to your kids, sometimes you got to take a car. Anyway, but I remember being so depressed that I'd left the label and I'd parted ways with my manager at the time and my guitar player / partner in crime. I felt so alone and the heating wasn't working on the bus. I woke up in my sweatshirt and my sweatpants and I was still freezing. The bus was off and everyone was gone. I stepped outside the bus and the casino must have been a half a mile away. I started walking on the iced over parking lot and I fell. I was lying alone on the ice staring up at the sky as snow fell on my face, and I wanted to cry, but I just stayed there and I waited for my heart to slow down. Somehow a casino employee noticed me and drove down in a golf cart and helped me out. I must have looked like a homeless person, since that's my look anyways. But anyway, he scooped me up and he drove me to the casino entrance. I thanked him and then I didn't say a word after that, immediately entered the casino, went right for the bathroom, and I puked. So when I was writing this song, that was one of the somehow traumatic experiences that I'd had since I left the Nashville system that clawed its way into that song. I feel that moment in the bus when I woke up freezing in my sweatshirt. I believe my socks were wet. It was just a mess. And I feel that every single time I say that line on stage. Another line that always takes me back to an exact moment in time is all of the wounded that you left for dead who now creep in the corners in the hall in my head. One time, I was on another artist tour bus and Travis Tritt was sitting there. He was talking about all these Nashville country legends and old Opry guys who now are so old they can't take care of themselves, and Nashville won't do a single thing to help them. Yes, we have the Merle Haggards and the George Joneses who had a big enough career to sustain them financially for life, but there are a lot of guys who had big hits in their time that weren't able to make the money last. Travis was talking about his dream of starting an old folks home for famous country singers, basically, and trying to find a way to fund it. A lot of these guys pass their moments and they don't have a dime to their name. It's not a matter of how they spin it. It's just a matter of how the Nashville industry, more than many other industries, turned their back on the stars of the previous moment with incredible disdain. I remember thinking about that at that moment in my life and thinking, how am I going to be able to sustain? Everyone thinks I inherited a bunch of money and I'm sleeping on $100 bills every night, but I did not. My parents were great to me, but they also knew what it meant to be on your own, and so did I. I never wanted a handout, and I never took one. I mean, sure, my parents helped me here and there, and I was much more fortunate than a lot of people. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying I didn't want them to help me make it in music. I didn't want to rely on that. I built my world all by myself, and in a lot of cases, the shadow, as I keep calling it, hurt me more than it helped me. But Travis's care about the older artist's well-being stuck in my head. Now, the last line that really stands out to me is the last line before the final refrain. It says, "All of the ships who came carrying oars that you wrecked in anger upon distant shores." This one means the most. This one's the whole song to me. There have been so many progressive artists that have come along and were regarded as rebels that Nashville absolutely did not want to succeed. My dad was one. Willie was one. Merle was one. I could go on and on. Fortunately, the people stood up and the size of the audience grew to a point that their success was undeniable. Then and only then, the Nashville machine said, "Oh yeah, he's our boy. We've been behind him the whole time." Bullshit. This is what Sturgill Simpson was getting so much press for saying about Merle. Here are these artists that really connect with the common community, that really offer an example of great, honest music. And the Nashville music business did everything they could to cause as many storms and wreck their ships. This mentality has always been, if you let them in, then the whole bunch of hillbillies will show up and we won't have control anymore. And they were right, especially in the case of Waylon Jennings. He was signed by Chet Atkins to RCA Records, but they did everything in their power to make him the next Jim Reeves and discount his own style, his own sound, powered by his band. It's like his talent was so strong that they had to try and take it into the system and tame it. It's like Howard Stern. It's like John Lennon. It's like anyone who had a vision that connected with the people. They're afraid of that because they can't calculate that. They can't predict that, and they can't control it. And that's what they do. They take someone who's showing up with the resources to unite and free the entire population, and then they try and wreck them and send them into exile, like Ophiuchus. They put them down, and then they try to provoke them to do themselves in. That's the big move. But then, when their popularity explodes, then the Nashville business pretends that they were always behind him, and he's their boy. This sums up most any entertainment business that thrives off money. They always carbon copy pop guys. And look, I'm not going to get into the whole country music discussion. But look what's been dominating the market, man. It's garbage for the most part. It's a system of songwriters, producers, radio, and label guys all working together. And a lot of times, these same teams are making all the copies. And they're all reading the same directions on the same Betty Crocker box. You know what I'm saying, Vern? The mavericks in music have the hardest time, but they make the biggest impact. It's also why I'm against this subsector of Americana. I think it floods the market with below-average boring music while also doing a disservice to people like Jason Isbell and Sturgill Simpson. These are straight-out country artists if you want to get down to it. Sturgill's making very progressive records without any care for what the system says, and Americana is giving him a nice, comfy place to set it down so that country music doesn't have to acknowledge it. I think cutting out the subgenres is the answer, or it's going to be part of the answer. And I know some of you that have followed me remember Triple X. I'm proud of what we did. I was trying to make a subgenre that would acknowledge all these bands that I liked. And in my opinion, it served as a positive connector for a lot of us to communicate in a previously more disjointed community, but at the end of the day, subgenres do a disservice, and I felt like I did in many ways. So I'm not flip-flopping. I'm acknowledging that it wasn't the right answer. But it's the will of the people that control what really happens. And corporate America and mainstream media do their best to try and keep the narrative they want going. The machine has to keep going so they can stay in control. Part 2. Fuck you, I'm famous.
To all the kids that picked on me in school, fuck you, I'm famous. You left me out 'cause I wasn't cool. Fuck you, I'm famous. To all the girls that said I wouldn't make fuck it. You, I'm famous. To all the girls that I couldn't get naked. Fuck you, I'm famous. To all the suckers that said I wouldn't matter. Fuck you, I'm famous. You're still hanging from your social ladder. Fuck you, I'm famous. To all the sleaze that got me on my knees. Fuck you, I'm famous. From the top of the trees, I can smell you, your disease.
Celebrity culture is a motherfucker, isn't it? We've seen the years go by from Marilyn Monroe to Michael Jackson to Caitlyn, Kim, and Kanye. This is how our world works ever since the advent of movies, music, and television. People love to lose their lives in the fantasy world of celebrity culture. I feel like as a kid, all we had was like the National Enquirer and Tiger Beat. Shit like that. But we had Spin magazine and we had all that stuff. I was into music, rock and roll. Rolling Stone was about following Trent Reznor and Marilyn Manson or Axl Rose, man. But I don't remember there being so much of a celebrity culture like there is now. Now we have this oversaturated world of celebrity magazines. Quote-unquote celebrity news, and then of course reality shows. Yeah, thanks Ozzy. I remember when we were recording Black Ribbons, I was also trying to write a script for a movie to go with it. A guy named A. Kareem Karmi had somehow been brought into my world, and I can't exactly remember how we met. But he liked Black Ribbons, and he liked this idea I was writing. But I was throwing around a lot of ideas. I wanted to paint a picture of a revolt of celebrity culture. Like people were going to finally feel like they'd had enough of the mainstream corporate agenda and the dumb, degenerate people being shoved down our throats by Mr. Time Warner and his better-than-you friends. In the story, we were trying to write this moment where everyone finally had enough and burned Us Weekly to the ground. It really felt like at the time people were poor and hurting and confused post 9/11 and nobody really wanted to see those rich fucking famous brats shoved down our throats. Oh man. Well, needless to say, the film didn't happen, but Black Ribbons did come out, and in many ways, Black Ribbons was influenced also with my disgust with the culture of celebrity of our time. At least when I was a kid, the celebrities had talent, man. I mean, Michael Jackson was a genius songwriter and musician, regardless of if he ran one of the most sophisticated child sex trafficking operations of all time. I mean, come on, a theme park? How many levels up from a van marked free candy is that? But celebrity culture has always generated a dark opposite. Newton's law can be applied in so many places. For every action, there is an equal and as powerful reaction. And this is where we will discuss celebrity stalking. There are so many cases of celebrity stalking that it's hard to keep up with them all. Most of them we don't even hear about. I'm going to touch on a few of them that you may already know about, and then I'm going to touch on some you might not have heard. Celebrity stalking in most cases is less a crime or gun issue and more a mental health issue. We're all probably still pretty fresh with the story of the Voice star, Christina Grimmie, being shot to death by Kevin James Loibl at an autograph signing in Orlando, Florida, just days before Omar Mateen shot and killed 50 people in that gay nightclub. Kevin believed that he was meant to be with Christina. He was obsessed, convinced that he and Christina were soulmates, and he was jealous of our other relationships. And his switch flipped big time. He killed her. He lived like a hermit, people say. There's always someone out there focusing on someone else in this celebrity culture, obsessing. I know. I've seen it happen. Celebrity stalkers are most likely cases of someone who has a serious mental disorder that goes untreated, whether it's schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or even psychosis in some situations. It seems that usually the stalker is someone who has a lack of a grip on reality and are hearing voices and narratives in their head that they can't separate from reality. They believe that they're communicating with or seeing this star, and they believe they are meant to be with this person. Also, in a lot of cases, the star even replying or attempting to set the record straight usually results in the person stalking them twice as hard and blaming everyone around the object of their affection from keeping them from them. Does that make sense? The first rule of being stalked, if there is a rule book for something like this, is to disengage. Never have contact with the stalker and hope they'll eventually target someone else and move on. But in many cases that doesn't work, and in the United States, and in Hollywood in particular, they don't have protective laws set in place for this kind of stuff. Shame on them. They need to help more. The LAPD needs to help more. Let's look at the famous Rebecca Schaeffer case. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from a story called The Death of Rebecca Schaeffer by Frank Wilkins. In the late 1980s, a young actress named Rebecca Lucille Schaeffer was struggling to find her big break in the show business. Born in 1967, the only child of a psychologist and a writer, Rebecca was sleek, svelte, and beautiful. A beauty that would later land her on the cover of 17 magazine. She was at the beginning of a promising career as an actress when an unemployed Tucson, Arizona fast food worker who had developed an obsession struck her down in 1989. Schaefer couldn't even afford a phone when her agent tacked a note on her apartment door telling her to report to the set of My Sister Sam, her breakthrough role starring opposite Pam Dauber of Mork and Mindy fame. She moved from New York to California and rented an apartment in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles in a Tudor-style building at 120 North Sweetser. She lived a quiet life, alone. The show was a huge success, but Rebecca would never live to enjoy it. Now, Robert John Bardo was the youngest of 7 siblings, son of a former Air Force officer. He grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the object of much physical and mental abuse. According to one of his teachers, Bardo was a time bomb on the verge of exploding. When he was 13, Bardo took a bus to Maine in search of Samantha Smith. She was the child that became famous for sending a letter to Mikhail Gorbachev. The authorities found him and they returned him to Tucson. He was hospitalized 2 times because of severe emotional damages. At 16, while working as a janitor for a fast food restaurant, Bardo found a better reality in television. In the fall of 1986, he became a fan of My Sister Sam. In particular, Bardo became obsessed with the character of Patty, played by Rebecca Schaefer. He built a shrine to her in his bedroom. Like millions of fans, Bardo started to write letters to her. Rebecca responded, writing that his letter was the most beautiful that she had ever received. On her letter, she drew a peace sign and a heart and signed it, "With love, from Rebecca." The day that Bardo received this letter, he wrote in his diary, "When I think of her, I would like to become famous to impress her." In June 1987, Bardo arrived at the Burbank studio gates where My Sister Sam was produced, carrying a teddy bear and a bouquet of roses for Rebecca. Naturally, the guard didn't let him in. Then Bardo returned a month later with a knife, but that didn't gain him entrance either. In his diary, he wrote, "I don't lose. Period." So Bardo returned to Tucson. Now later on, he saw Rebecca's new film, Class Struggle in Beverly Hills. In the movie, Rebecca had a bed scene with a male actor, which gravely upset Bardo. He couldn't envision his innocent young girl being an adult woman. To him, she had now become one more of the bitches of Hollywood. Bardo decided that Rebecca had to be punished for her immorality. He drew a diagram of her body and marked spots where he planned to shoot her. He asked his older brother, Edgar, to buy him a gun. Bardo, 21, bombarded Rebecca with swarms of love letters. He also collected videos of Rebecca's TV shows, Amazing Stories, My Sister Sam, One Life to Live. He bedecked his room with dozens of glossy publicity photos of the girl he lusted for. He even mailed an ominous-sounding letter to his sister in Tennessee, telling her that if he couldn't have Rebecca, no one else would. Then he hopped a Hollywood-bound bus in Tucson, hell-bent on tracking her down. On July 17, 1989, Bardo called Schaefer's agent's office and tried to find out where she lived. Refused this information, he relentlessly roamed the streets, flashing her photo and asking passersby if they knew her address. He needlessly paid a private detective $250 to find her. Needlessly, because for as little as $1, a person could go to any of California DMV offices, fill out a Form 70 stating who they are, what person they want information on, the reason, and how they intend to use it. Even if they lie, the information is delivered on the spot. Armed with this information, on July 18, 1989, Bardo, dressed in a yellow polo shirt, rang Rebecca Schaefer's doorbell. The intercom wasn't working, so she came downstairs to the apartment building's front door, where she saw Bardo and basically ignored his attention. He left, and he grabbed a meal of onion rings and cheesecake at Jan's restaurant at 8424 Beverly Boulevard in Los Angeles. After about an hour, Bardo returned to the house and rang the bell again. Still in her housecoat, Schaefer came to the front door, turned the handle, and opened it. Bear with me. I tell you guys this lengthy backstory to really put you inside the situation, inside the heads of Bardo and of Schaefer, and to allow you to see all the ingredients that went into this pressure cooker of a situation. Wilkins' story continues by telling Bardo's own account of the incident. This is a quote from him. "She had this kid voice, sounded like a little brat or something. Said I was wasting her time. No matter what, I thought it was a very callous thing to say to a fan, you know? I grab the door, gun still in the bag, I grab it by the trigger, I come around and kapow! And she's like screaming, why, and it's like, oh God. The story concludes with his arrest and conviction. A neighbor named Richard Goldman heard the 2 gunshots and 2 blood-curdling screams and rushed to her door and found Rebecca Schaefer's body clad in a black robe twitching in the building's foyer. He checked her pulse, but found none. Her arms were akimbo and her feet wedged between the door and its frame. Witnesses saw a young man in a yellow shirt jogging up the Hollywood block. He turned into an alley and then disappeared. Sirens screaming, Rebecca was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She lingered for about 30 minutes before she died. The next day, back in Tucson, several motorists called 911 to report a man running around in traffic on Interstate 10. He looked like he was trying to get hit. He confessed immediately to Schaefer's murder. Arizona police faxed his photo to LA and witnesses confirmed his identity. In court, he appeared dazed and confused. "I could probably tell you what I did after I killed her, how I got sick and all, but I don't feel like it," he said. A year after the slaying, Bardo gave an interview in which he stated, "I was a fan of hers and I may have carried it too far, but a lot of things have appeared in the press to make me out to be a monster. If I had one wish where it was ever to come true, it would be for Rebecca Schaefer to be alive today." When Bardo's sister heard about the murder, she contacted the police about her brother. He was extradited to California. Bardo's defense attorneys pleaded that he had an unstable mental condition due to childhood abuse. Bardo was tried and convicted by prosecutor Marcia Clark, who would later become most famous for her unsuccessful attempts to prosecute O.J. Simpson in the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend. Convicted of capital murder in a non-jury courtroom, Bardo was sentenced to life without parole by Superior Court Judge Dino Fulgoni on December 20th, 1991. Eyes flashing like satanic neons, Bardo told the judge, "The idea I killed her for fame is totally ridiculous. I do realize the magnitude of what I've done. I don't think it needs to be compounded by a bunch of lies because she's an actress." As I said before, I know that's a lot, but it just puts so much into perspective on this story. It shows how Bardo had his issues to begin with and how even the most benign response from Schaefer only fanned the flame of his singular targeted lunacy. Following Rebecca Schaefer's murder, California laws regarding the release of personal information through the DMV were drastically changed. The Driver's Privacy Protection Act was enacted in 1994, which prevents the DMV from releasing private addresses. Another note that popped up in the comments to this story anecdotally tells of Bardo buying the gun that he used. When Robert John Bardo tried to purchase the .357 Magnum at Jensen's Firearms in Tucson, Arizona in the summer of 1989, he filled out the paperwork answering yes to having been committed to a mental facility, a disqualification. He was also underage, but he had a fake driver's license that would have worked. The salesman, a member of the Air Force named Bob, told him that he could not purchase the revolver. Bardo got irate and said he wanted to fill out another copy. And the salesman straight out told him no. And then he sought help, and Jerome LaRochelle, who also worked at Jensen's, told the guy absolutely no way and told Bardo that he could not own a firearm and get the fuck out. Because he did not like the vibes he got from him, obviously. Then the two escorted Bardo from the store. LaRochelle, his friend Bob, and the manager on duty at Jensen's hung Bardo's disqualification form on the bulletin board and wrote, "Do not sell to this individual." The next morning, Bardo came in with his brother, who purchased the same .357 Magnum and gave it to his brother when they were outside of the shop. A violation of federal law, BTW. His brother would have known that because it asks you that question on the form and warns you that such straw man purchases are violations of federal law. Bardo then used that revolver to fatally shoot Rebecca Schaefer on July 18th. While this whole story is so sad and dark, it, along with the John Lennon killing, began telling the dark sub-story beneath the culture of celebrity. Modern celebrity. I have a few more stories along these lines if y'all don't mind. They'll be short, I promise. Dolly Parton's classic song, Jolene, became Parton's second solo #1 single on the country charts after being released as a single in late 1973. It's the most recorded song of hers by other artists. The White Stripes even did a badass version of it.
Jolene, 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 Jolene. Please don't take him just because you can.
A lot of people thought that the song was a true song about a bank teller having a crush on Dolly's husband, but she actually wrote the song after meeting a young girl who wanted an autograph, and Dolly asked her what her name was. She replied, Jolene. Dolly was so struck by the beauty of her name that she wrote a song inspired by it. Well, one day Dolly came home, and there was a little box on her doorstep. Inside the box was a baby, and with a note on it, and it read, "My name is Jolene. My mama has left me here, and she wants you to have me." Parton understandably freaked out and called social services, who took care of the child. Parton has said that she often wondered whether baby Jolene ever came to one of her concerts, but there was no way to track her down, and she didn't really want to try anyway. Now, Conan O'Brien was even stalked by a priest. The priest sent him tons and tons of DVDs and letters, and eventually he attempted to break into a taping of the Conan O'Brien show, or I guess the Late Night with Conan O'Brien. Then there's Selena. If you're over 30, you remember the TV movie with Jennifer Lopez playing Selena. In 1992, Selena's father gave a woman named Saldivar permission to assemble a fan club for his daughter. She was basically Selena's nanny. But in March of 1995, Selena's family learned that Saldivar was embezzling money from the organization and fired her. Possibly hoping to work things out, Selena agreed to meet with Saldivar 3 weeks later to discuss the club's financial records. But during their discussion, Saldivar fatally shot the singer in a room at the Days Inn in Corpus Christi. Catherine Zeta-Jones was stalked by Donette Knight, a 32-year-old woman who was wanting to become a child psychologist. In 2004, Knight sent threatening letters and described in one of these how she would cut Zeta-Jones into little pieces and feed her to the dogs. She also knew the name of their nanny and the layout of their house. But not all of them are trying to kill these celebrities. Sometimes they're just plain nutty. This is one of my favorite ones. A guy broke into Puff Daddy's Hamptons vacation home and wore his clothes and swam in his pool and drank his booze. He evaded being caught on the premises, but it was apparent someone had been there. Over time, this guy would return. One summer, he was caught on the property wearing Puff Daddy's robe, drinking in the pool when they demanded he leave the property and called the police on him. When he was asked to leave, he said, it wasn't that nice anyway. That one always cracked me up. But I want to talk about a deeper topic now within this. In the story of John Hinckley Jr. and the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, Hinckley Jr. became obsessed with Jodie Foster after watching Taxi Driver. In this film, Robert De Niro plays Travis Bickle, a mentally unstable war veteran that plans to kill a presidential nominee. Hinckley focused and obsessed on Foster. Even when Foster entered Yale University, John Hinckley Jr. moved to New Haven, Connecticut for a short time just to stalk her. He enrolled in a Yale writing class, began slipping poems and messages under Foster's door, and repeatedly called her. Failing to develop any meaningful contact with the actress, Hinckley fantasized about conducting an aircraft hijacking or committing suicide in front of her just to get her attention. Eventually, he settled on a scheme to impress her by assassinating the president, thinking that by achieving a place in history, he would appeal to her as an equal. Hinckley trailed President Jimmy Carter from state to state and was arrested in Nashville, Tennessee on a firearms charge. Penniless, he returned home. Despite psychiatric treatment for depression, his mental health did not improve. He began to target the newly elected president, Ronald Reagan, in 1981. To this purpose, he collected materials on the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Hinckley wrote the following to Foster just before his attempt on Reagan's life. Over the past 7 months, I've left you dozens of poems, letters, and love messages in a faint hope that you could develop an interest in me. Although we talked on the phone a couple of times, I never had the nerve to simply approach you and introduce myself. The reason I'm going to go ahead with this attempt now is because I cannot wait any longer to impress you. John Hinckley Jr. On March 30th, 1981, in Washington, D.C., he attempted to assassinate U.S. President Ronald Reagan. Hinckley wounded Reagan with a bullet that ricocheted and hit him in the chest. Hinckley also wounded police officer Thomas Delahanty and Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy, and he critically wounded press secretary James Brady. All of the shooting victims survived, although Brady's 2014 death was later ruled a homicide. Hinckley was found not guilty because he was insane, and he was put under psychiatric care until September 2016, the day before September 11th. He lives with his mother full-time now, but he's out. I wonder how Jodie Foster feels about this. That being said, there's another part to this story. As the Manchurian Candidate brought to the big screen twice, there's always been the conspiracy theory about government mind control programs and operatives. If you've ever seen the 1997 Richard Donner film starring Mel Gibson, Conspiracy Theory, they touch on the Hinckley story and pretty much brought a lot of these older conspiracy theories into the mainstream. I'm sure most of you have heard of the Catcher in the Rye thing. Hinckley had a copy of the Catcher in the Rye on his person when he attempted to shoot the president. After Mark David Chapman shot and killed John Lennon, he calmly opened up Catcher in the Rye and proceeded to read it before being apprehended. From an article on henrymakow.com, it gets worse. Sirhan Sirhan, the alleged lone gunman of the Robert F. Kennedy assassination in 1968, also had a copy of Catcher in the Rye. Since then, the rumors have grown that the book contains some kind of trigger code, recognizable only to the subconscious minds of MKUltra programmed sleepers. In a turn of phrase borrowed from Catcher in the Rye, Chapman became convinced that John Lennon was a phony. Chapman allegedly would chant to himself over and over, "The phony must die," says the Catcher in the Rye. This was an eerie parallel to Sirhan Sirhan's constantly rewritten mantra of "RFK must die." Chilling. A lot of people have drawn this conclusion in modern times that Catcher in the Rye was some kind of trigger command for someone who'd been brainwashed into mind control. A sleeper, as I said before, is someone who was laying in wait, waiting for their big moment to happen, waiting for their one trigger to happen, and the idea that had been programmed into them so long ago would become active. Just like in the book and the films of the Manchurian Candidate, the idea of programmed assassins and triggers were introduced into the public mainstream via entertainment. But this stuff is very real, folks. Another great film discussing a lot of the true tales of mind control programs is The Men Who Stare at Goats. There was a lot of experimenting going on back then, and there's still a lot of it going on right now. I even heard a story that's kind of funny recently. A good friend of mine who I haven't talked to in a while. If you're still out there, and you've been following this Black Ribbons Ultimate Edition release thing we've been doing, then I'm sure you've been catching some of these Beyond the Blacks. If you do hear this, you'll know who you are. And after you hear this story, you realize that I'm trying to reach out to you, so please email me at shooter@beyondthe.black. I would love to hear from you. Anyway, this guy had some of these contacts behind the scenes, if you will, deep and rooted in the muckiest stuff. I mean governments. I mean whistleblowers. But he told me he had a story about a cat. Now, mind you, this was around the time that Black Ribbons had just come out. This guy reached out to me because he was a fan of the record and he really wanted to try to get the message out to a bigger audience. We were visiting at my house and I was picking his brain, and I wanted him to tell me some of the wildest stories that he'd ever heard from this underground subculture of conspiracy and all this. And one of the stories he told me was that there was this cat somewhere in a deep, dark, underground government facility. And these scientists had figured out a way to remote control this cat's brain. They spent decades developing this, took a baby cat and worked with it for years and years, until they could literally control the cat remotely. The plan was they could outfit this cat with a microphone or a camera and be able to travel into a dark alley or over a roof and spy. Imagine the possibilities. Remove the cat's eye, put in a camera, use this little remote control, it looks like a Nintendo controller, and you're controlling a cat and doing things that only a cat can do and recording all of it. And nobody would suspect a silly old cat. Well, after all these years of development with this super cat, they decided to try it out. They let the cat out, grabbed their controller, and as it was crossing the street, it was hit and killed by a car. They immediately gave up on that program and moved on to the next idea. That always cracked me up. But this mind control stuff is very real, folks. If that is any indication how far they'll go to try controlling other beings. Another fairly well-known tale is that of the MKUltra program, as we discussed above. From 1953 to 1964, the CIA conducted many experiments using biological and chemical agents on American citizens without their knowledge. Everything from drugging people to exposing them to hazardous chemicals without their knowledge. You know, the kind of things you're really hoping that your government would do to you and your family without you knowing. In 1977, all of the information on the MKUltra program was made public, and it's horrific. Much like what happened later with the psychic exploration programs of the Be All That You Can Be Army, the reason they got into this was out of fear that the other side had started researching this stuff. In this case, researching chemical and biological warfare. According to the 1977 hearing report, while they were declassifying this information about MKUltra, the development of a comprehensive capability in this field of covert chemical and biological warfare gives us a thorough knowledge of the enemy's theoretical potential, thus enabling us to defend ourselves against a foe who might not be as restrained in the use of these techniques as we are. Senator Edward Kennedy admitted an extensive testing and experimentation program which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. I wonder if this includes the 1951 Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisoning in southern France as well. The CIA and other government agencies just love to admit and unadmit almost everything under the sun they've done. Anyway, the report continued. The deaths of 2 Americans can be attributed to these programs. Other participants in the testing programs may still suffer from the residual effects. The fact that they were continued for years after the danger of surreptitious administration of LSD to unwitting individuals was known demonstrate fundamental disregard for the value of human life. In a story from Gizmodo on MKUltra written by Melissa Blevins at todayifoundout.com, one of these lives belonged to Dr. Frank Olson, himself a researcher with the U.S. Army who studied developing techniques for offensive use of biological weapons and biological research for the CIA. Along with a group of 9 other such scientists, he attended a conference in a cabin at Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, in November 1953. Once there, ironically, CIA operatives spiked the researchers' Cointreau with LSD. Only after the scientists had finished their drinks were they informed that they'd been drugged. Most of the researchers handled the experience well and had no after effects, but not Dr. Olson. He never recovered from the ordeal, and shortly after the experiment began to show symptoms of paranoia and schizophrenia. Dr. Olson's superior and the CIA who ran the experiment arranged for him to get treatment in New York City. While spending the night at a hotel room with the CIA officer and after requesting a wake-up call for the next morning, Dr. Olson somehow managed to fall to his death. As the CIA officer Lashbrook reported, at approximately 2:30 a.m. Saturday, November 28th, Lashbrook was awakened by a loud crash of glass. Olson had crashed through the closed window blind and the closed window, and he fell to his death from the window of our room on the 10th floor. Yeah, right. Sounds like you read that Excalibur book I was talking about last episode. Anyway, back to the 1977 MKUltra hearing report. As it finished, it said, "Perhaps the most disturbing of all was the fact that the extent of the experimentation on human subjects was unknown. The record of all these activities were destroyed in 1973 at the instruction of then CIA Director Richard Helms." Scary stuff. And all the destroying of the files. I mean, it's ridiculous with this Hillary stuff going on. I mean, they just tracked down a Reddit post of the guy who deleted Hillary's emails and wanted to change her name in the emails. He was asking in a Reddit forum how to do that, and they figured out who it was, and then all of a sudden, all of his posts deleted, everything went away, crazy cover-up stuff. It's wild what they do. But anyway, back to MKUltra. Many of these experiments dealt with mind control and creating the perfect assassin. You know what happened, folks. Whether we find out in our lifetime, the truth will come out. You can bet your ass on that. Now, I'd like to take a moment to remind you that not everything I'm reading is my words. I credit the authors of these articles so that you will, 1, understand who wrote the written material, and 2, realize that this is not necessarily my opinion or the opinion of the Beyond the Black team. That being said, I and we do not necessarily believe in a link between MKUltra program and Sandy Hook. But in an article called MKUltra Links to the Sandy Hook Assault, Yoichi Shimatsu writes, "My long-distance interest in the Sandy Hook events is based on ongoing work with a team of anti-pedophile journalists and activists who for over a decade have tracked and exposed American pedophile rings from Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, to Beijing, China. In all cases so far, our team has discovered that these frontline pedophiles supply children for sexual services to VIPs traveling in Asia, including diplomats from the highest levels of the White House and State Department, top executives of major corporations, and the heads of universities and aid agencies. Nearly all the patrons involved in this cruel pastime have backgrounds in U.S. intelligence, the CIA, NSA, or State Department. The individuals are from diverse religious backgrounds, Catholic, Jewish, and Orthodox, while the core facilitators are often priests with Jesuit orders, and to a lesser degree, Franciscans or Benedictines. At an orphanage in Cambodia, it took 3 years for our multinational team, against death threats from armed policemen and undisguised hostility from NGOs, to realize that expulsion of the pedophile coven, which includes a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, the celebrated head of a new media program at an Ivy League campus, and a renowned correspondent based at a Tokyo American club. When the police shut down their strong encryption computer center and satellite uplink used for sweetheart messaging and exporting child porn videos, the American pedophiles stripped out all of the programs, rendering a room of Apple computers inoperable. Later, at a celebration for liberation of the orphans from the grip of these abusive men and their compliant wives, the teachers told me that the average age of the boys and the girls who had been invited to sleep over at these weekend parties was 10 years old. Yoichi continues to tell of his experience investigating pedophilia. He talks about how, because of the internet, that the age of pedophiles is becoming younger and younger. College-age kids are now having access to a treasure trove of hardcore porn, and it's desensitizing them to a point of complete loss of touch with reality. Then these types of young pedophiles become the types who lure the younger kids into these rings for the older, more rich fat cats who bankroll the whole thing and make the big money. Yoichi continues by backtracking and drawing the direct correlation with J.D. Salinger, who wrote Catcher in the Rye and MKUltra. He speaks of Operation Paperclip, which is when the U.S. smuggled in the smartest German Jewish scientists from Nazi Germany into the United States in return for their work for the U.S. Albert Einstein was in this bunch. During the war in Europe, a non-commissioned officer of Russian Jewish descent assigned to U.S. Defense Intelligence worked on Operation Paperclip, the transport of Nazi scientists into U.S. laboratories, and Project Artichoke, smuggling German Jews into Palestine in support of a Zionist state. This officer's name was J.D. Jerry Salinger. Later, he served in the counterintelligence corps, debriefing and reassigning Nazi officers, including those who had conducted psychiatric experiments on prisoners of war. At war's end, Salinger lived in Tarrytown, New York, but was soon ordered to move across the state border to Stamford, Connecticut, close to Fairfield University. He resided in a converted barn out of public view, presumably to continue his special area of intelligence work, the field testing of the MKUltra methods refined by the sadistically clinical Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the pseudonym of Joseph Scheider, the man who ran the main mind control lab at the Jesuit-run Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., which is also a finishing school for diplomats in the State Department. In the Connecticut countryside during his lost years, Salinger penned The Catcher in the Rye, which contains the command code words for MKUltra assassins. The protagonist, Holden Caulfield, is a study of a paranoid, passive-aggressive character whose favorite expression is, "You're killing me." Yoichi continues to tell how the CIA partners with organized crime in New England. Around 1950, while Salinger was in Stamford, the CIA recruited a South Boston convict nicknamed Whitey Bulger to supply young runaways for mind control experiments under the fast-expanding MKUltra programs being set up at 44 universities across the United States. The centers for the New England drug experiments were probably the Whiting Forensic Facility at the Connecticut Valley Hospital in Middleford, Connecticut, and Bridgewater Hospital in Massachusetts, the region's psychiatric facilities for the criminally insane. With CIA backing, Bulger built up his Winter Hill Gang, composed mainly of Irishmen, who strong-armed their way into control over Boston's gambling scene and drug trafficking. While little is known about the political activities of the Bulger Gang, its rise to crime dominance coincided with the expansion of weapons smuggling in Northern Ireland in support of the IRA. A parallel of cross-Atlantic traffic in drugs and illegal immigration in the reverse direction began at the same time. The predominantly Irish political machine of Boston, from the Prohibition-era smuggling tycoon Joseph Kennedy Sr. to House Majority Leader Tip O'Neill, gave their blessing to the flourishing organized crime network and voiced support for the patriotic IRA freedom fighters, who returned the favor to Washington with murderous attacks on American-loathing British figures such as Lord Mountbatten. So now we have The Catcher in the Rye being written specifically with triggers in mind, and the correlation with Whitey Bulger in all of this. So, in 2011, Bulger made headlines with his arrest in Malibu, California, where he'd been living for more than a decade undetected despite being on the FBI's most wanted list, on a long vacation thanks to his relationship with the CIA. If there's one point of irritation, however, between the Irish mobster and his controllers, it was his opposition to drug use by teenagers. After seeing firsthand how MKULTRA had destroyed the minds of his young recruits, Bulger ordered his gang members never to sell drugs to teenagers. Even a ruthless mobster had more decency than the self-styled patriots who run the intelligence services. Now Yuichi jumps to Newtown, Connecticut, and he reiterates the fact that the town was already riddled by pedophilia. Newtown, like Fairfield and Stamford, is part of the Diocese of Bridgeport, which got into legal trouble in 2001 due to the lawsuits by 23 victims of pedophilia committed by priests. Bishop Edward Egan, then diocese head, was a protector of sexual offender priests, sending them to other areas when parental complaints reached the ears of the police. The great movie Spotlight deals with a lot of this. After the plaintiffs won an out-of-court settlement, the diocese petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to quash the thousands of documents detailing the beastly sex crimes. In 2009, Opus Dei honcho, Justice Antonin Scalia, he determined that the court records should not be made public. And I've got to say that this is the same Supreme Court Judge Antonin Scalia that just died while he was on a quote-unquote hunting trip. It is widely speculated that he died while attending one of these power elite getaways where often these kind of pedophile trafficking situations were bartered. Yoichi describes these secret groups as a coven, and he continues to draw the correlation that Sandy Hook was an act of retaliation. Nancy Lanza kept an arsenal of firearms and ordered her son to be constantly under watch by older boys. She must have had a good reason for being armed to the teeth. Judging from her hoard of rifles and handguns, she was expecting an all-out assault from a coven of pedophiles, not an attack by a single shooter. The lone gun boy theory is sheer nonsense. Her son may have been an accomplice in giving the assailants access to his home, but ended up murdered as a patsy. The coven is larger and more powerful than Miss Lanza could have ever imagined. Sexual violation is the key to creating intelligence agents and assassins who are impervious to reason and mercy, lacking any original thoughts or moral qualms. Plus, a supply of children is needed in Congress and the White House to entertain the satraps and moguls from Colombian drug lords to Israeli weapon dealers and French money launderers, not to mention America's own homegrown pervs. Yoichi describes what he believes to be the motive. If the culprits had really been Adam Lanza and his pals, then their response to grounding would have been something like posting photos of naked kids or addresses or something. The method of shooting point-blank execution-style gunshots indicate that the assailants were professional hitmen, probably allied with the Winter Hill Gang. The Sandy Hook assault happened probably because of a split between competing institutions and diverging policies. On one hand, the gangland figures who cooperated with CIA mind control programs that promoted child sex as a means of ensuring obedience and secrecy were probably being challenged by politicians playing up a parental demand to clean up the scandalous child sex problems in Connecticut. Now see, Yoichi there wraps it up by trying to draw a picture of the conflict from within the government systems, CIA versus the FBI versus local government, and how they do things to silence the other person. Whether or not that's true about Sandy Hook or not, we don't know, and it was a terrible thing. I remember the day it happened. I have children. It broke my heart. But whether or not this is reality, there's definitely a huge amount of knowledge that's withheld from the American people. The MKUltra program happened, and they did horrific things to the American people. These stories, truth or fiction, even relate to our earlier discussions on the Franklin scandal. Why are these politicians always needing a never-ending supply of child sex slaves? Is it satanic ritualism? Are they used for Bohemian Grove party favors? I doubt this. Bohemian Grove isn't even that exclusive anymore. I know musicians that go there and play in the pickup bands. It's not that big of a deal, just a bunch of old people without their cell phones. But Who knows? But is it simply a throwback to the cultures of Rome and Greece, where this Caligula-style vileness wasn't even hidden? Was it those depraved ways that led to the downfall of those major empires? I don't know. I gotta stop myself before I turn into Russ Cole and end up in a storage unit with maps and hints tacked up on the walls looking for a pattern. As I've told you all numerous times, I'm not asking you to believe what's being said. I'm just simply asking you to keep an open mind for what could be out there. And it quite frankly gives me the heebie-jeebies for all this government cover-up stuff to be tied into the fucked up kitty shit. So now we reach the end of this Beyond the Black. And whether or not all this is true or Yoichi has some weird ideas, it's all very fascinating. Governments around the world will always try and develop new and more dangerous weapons, even at the expense of the civilian people. But as long as there's a corrupt government out there trying to create a new mind-controlled cat assassin, and as long as there's a cop shooting a guy, or as long as there's a vast governmental conspiracy to empower the perverted globalist elite, look into their eyes, Ma, and you'll see me. I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in for yet another edition of Beyond the Black. If you have something to add or debunk or just need a friend, please reach out to me at shooter@beyondthe.black. That's the email address, shooter@beyondthe.black, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And towards the end of the series, we're going to start getting into what some of your emails said. But there's only 3 more episodes of Beyond the Black, and then the Black Ribbons Ultimate Edition will be out in stores. You can now pre-order a signed copy or an unsigned copy of the Black Ribbons Ultimate Pack by visiting bcrmedia.com. You can pre-order it directly from us, get it on the day it's released, Election Day. The Black Ribbons Ultimate Edition comes with 2 remastered vinyl LPs, 2 CDs, one of which is filled with 75 minutes of extras, remixes, and outtakes. Then there's a digital download card that includes all of the above, as well as all of the Beyond the Black series, several full live shows, and special other extras not included in the physical packaging. Sorry for the shill, but we got to pay for these Beyond the Black somehow. So bcrmedia.com is the place for you to pre-order yours now. It's limited. It's very special packaging. It's a box set, essentially. So go to bcrmedia.com. Beyond the Black is written by Shooter Jennings with Brad Jewell and is a production of Black Country Rock in association with J&J Productions. For an archive of all the released episodes, as well as a schedule for future episodes, please visit www.beyondthe.black. Well, thanks for listening, folks. Until October 8th, when episode 5 comes out. Take care and treat each other kind. And remember, you may have felled the storm and swam until the skies were clear, but hopefully you found a home along this crooked road. Until next week, this is Shooter Jennings, signing off.
Swam until the skies were clear, and I found a home along this crooked road. And all of this would have been, all of this could have been yours. All of this should have been, all of this could have been.
In secure transmission. Stay tuned for future messages. Everything is illusion.